I would say this baby is ready. This video is all about a classic receiver that became the mainstay of many Novice stations. The Heathkit HR-10 and the follow-on HR-10B, really the same receiver, same exact circuit, came on the market in 1963 as a kit. And in the July 1963 issue of QST, the receivers really announced formally with an article as a recent equipment type article. There have been many videos, many articles, improvements, modifications, and stories about this receiver over the years. And I finally have one of them. I want to use it in the Novice Part 2 video that's coming up. First, we need to find out what I've purchased. This particular unit came right off eBay. It was well packaged. Looks like the outer case has been repainted, but a pretty nice job. The HR-10 is different than the HR-10B. The HR-10B has a crinkle finish with the green, and the HR-10, which came earlier, has a smooth green finish on the paint. That's the only difference that anyone can seem to come up with. So we're going to do a kind of a rejuvenation or a restoration in the sense that we just want to get the receiver as it was in the 60s. And if the receiver lives up to its reputations, it will have a few warts and it will have a few shortcomings that we'll have to talk about. But I'm not going to do any modifications to the receiver. I'm simply going to bring it back to usable condition, and we're going to use it on the air just as a novice would have between the years 1963 and 1975, when the receiver actually came off the Heathkit offerings. That's a long life for any receiver. And what it tells you that it is a very good design, and it really filled a niche in the young ham radio operators' needs for that period of time. So this is a home run as far as form goes. Function, probably good enough for a novice. We're going to find out as we bring this receiver back to life. So a receiver with such a nice looking cover, arriving well packed from eBay. Pretty good news. But, sometimes things can be a little dirtier and a little rustier than advertised. Judging a book by its cover, so to speak. But you know what? This is a perfect candidate for what we want to do, which is to put the receiver back in operational condition. And the hard parts are there. The actual front panel is in excellent condition. The plastic, the meter, the dial and the dial string, they're all in good shape. We can take care of all these chassis issues, and hopefully we can bring this receiver into good operating condition. Actually, considering what I paid for the receiver, I'm very surprised that it's got the calibrator. That was something that is a real bonus as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, this is going to turn out to be a fun project. Everything is there with this receiver. So as we begin the cleanup, we're going to pull all of the tubes. Some of them are obviously gassy, like this one is going. Pretty bad shape here. And we'll use the tube tester and go through all of these tubes and set them aside. take everything out, the calibrator, everything else that we can, remove the bottom, give it a good inspection, and then we'll start our cleaning process. So what's going on in here? You never know what you're going to find. So we're testing the 6x4, and F is one section. It's good. And the other section is A. It's good. So the tube's marked no good, but it's testing good. So I've taken all of the knobs off the front and torn it down, removed the switch and the pot hardware, and I opened up the calibrator and got the solder ball out of there that was wiggling around. See the surface rust that's on here, or the surface corrosion actually on aluminum? I'm going to be using this product called Never Dull that is basically a kind of a wadding product. And it's got some particulate in it that allow you to do polishing, and I'll be going over that corrosion with this Never Dull stuff, and we'll just be getting some of that off before I really do a good cleaning job. I want to remove some of that surface corrosion on the calibrator. Also, I'll go over the different pieces of hardware on the front before I reassemble the front. I did not completely tear down the front because I would have to upset the dial string arrangement, which seems to be working pretty well, so I'm not going to mess with that. I'm a little nervous about the plastic bezel on the front, so my cleaning is going to be a little more careful than on that last receiver that we did, the old AR-3. I'm going to have to be a little more careful on this one, getting it wet or using any harsh soaps or detergents on it. So a chassis that has as much rust on it as this did and as many blemishes is never going to look great, but we can at least arrest the rust by using navel jelly, and then getting in there with some very, very light sandpaper, and then hit it with some of the Never Dull. I have been able to clean up the crystal calibrator to the point where all the pits have been pretty much shined out with the Never Dull. And I gave the transformer a coat of flat black paint just by taping it off and spraying it in place, and it makes it look far better than it did before. It's had its bath, it's been dried out, and it's had most of the blemishes rubbed down. And the next step is going to be to give it a good inspection on the bottom, and then we're going to go through and hit all of the switches and contacts with deoxit, and we're going to do the lubrication of all of the bearings on the variable capacitors and switches. So the rail that the dial slides along can get pitted because the actual indicator needle, the pointer, can stay in one place, and then we can get some moisture in there and it'll actually pit and corrode, and that makes the tuning really rough along that edge. So you want to hit that with some really fine automotive grade wet sandpaper, and then maybe hit a little paste wax on there just to make that nice and smooth. So here's a few of the things you might want to use to do the lubrication of the variable capacitors and the switches. You're going to need a decent grease, maybe some penetrating oil, or machine oil they call it. So here's a kind of a silly idea. There's some dust in back of this bezel. To disassemble the entire front panel is a big chore. How could we take some of that dust off that bezel without destroying the without destroying the meter or the pointer? So here's what we'd like to do. We'd like to get something in back of that bezel. We can handle the front, of course, and take up some of that without damaging the lettering, and just getting rid of the dust. Sounds like a crazy idea, but I think we need to find out if we can get in there, and it looks like there is indeed a gap. And I can also see the needle down in there, so we're going to have to be really careful on this side of the receiver. But if we were to take some very thin and shiny cardboard, and then maybe some of this Bausch & Lomb Sight Saver stuff with just some isopropyl, I believe. It's one of those things that if you don't see it, you won't believe it can be done. Okay, I've literally got a Bausch & Lomb Sight Saver on this piece of thin cardboard, and I'm working it back and forth underneath the bezel. And now we're bringing it up, and look at all of this wonderful dirt. After my successful caper with the bezel on the front and the Bausch & Lomb lens cleaner, we're claiming success. We didn't destroy the meter. We now have lubricated all of the controls. We've hit everything with deoxit, and it's time to do the boring part, which is to loosen and tighten all of the fasteners. And the reason we're going to do this is to make sure that all our grounds are back to where they should be, because there's been a lot of oxidation on this chassis. We need to get all of those grounds tightened up, and it might mean the nut driver is going to have to come out in a big way, and we're going to have to get at all of that hardware. So before putting the pilot lamps back in the set, in this position and this position over here, I decided just to check them quickly with the meter, and sure enough, one of them is burned out. Any place on the chassis where you see a nut that is being used with a ground lug, those especially have to be retightened. So loosen the hardware, get in there, make sure you've got a very good ground on all of those lugs. I found that in this radio there were several that were fairly loose, and when those oxidize, it makes a nice diode rather than a good ground. After examining some of the solder joints in this radio, I would give it probably a 6 or 7. It's pretty well done. The original soldering is not bad at all in this corner, but there has been some fooling around over here in the RF sections. And in some cases, the bigger the blob, the better the job. So I'm not a fan of that AC cord. It's old and only a 2-prong. So let's see if we can put a 3-conductor AC cord on there. I've got a couple different candidates. We'll see which one works out the best. So you squeeze and push in, and the Heiko grommet will release. Oh, you might be saying to yourself, boy, Mike, you've done a lot of work on this receiver, and there's still no tubes in it. You haven't applied power. We've done a lot of cleanup on this receiver. We've got the chassis all cleaned up. We've got all the contacts cleaned. We've lubricated all the controls. We put a new power cord on it. And now the tuning dial is smooth, nice and smooth. We've cleaned up the bezel. So now it's time to actually apply power. No tubes are inserted at all, only the 2 pilot lamps. So we're going to test the transformer and see if it can work at all. I mean, this receiver could have a bad transformer. It could blow the fuse. That could be the results of this bring up. I have a small fused variac that I'm going to use, to bring the receiver up slowly. And I can see pilot lights lighting. That's a good sign. Pilot light on this side, the pilot light on the other side, both are lighting. This is a really good sign. Okay, we're up to 70%, 80%, 90%, 100. Okay, so it is lit up and we can certainly see the dial. Progress. Next we're going to load all the tubes in and see if we can get some high voltage out of it. So you might remember we had the 6BA6 that was decapitated. We're going to be replacing that tube. And tubes are in without their shields. I didn't bother putting the crystals back in. We're just going to see if everything lights up and we get some high voltage. All the capacitors are fully meshed for safety. We're going to flip the thing over and we're going to hook up a voltmeter. And we're going to bring the power up slowly and see if we can reform this electrolytic capacitor, which is a triple 20 microfarad. We've got the negative lead of the meter connected to the chassis ground and the positive lead attached to the positive input right off the rectifier tube, the 6X4. Remember, this is the same 6X4 that was marked no good. Okay, we're slowly bringing it on and I can see the pilot light is starting to come up. We'll bring it up to about 40% and leave it there. See if we get any movement at all. And we are. See, we're starting to get movement on the meter. Can you see that? That tells me that we are starting to get some emission on the rectifier tube, the 6X4. And it's attempting to reform that capacitor. You're watching the voltage come up. Okay, looks like it's settled in around 38 volts. And I also didn't mention, I've got a speaker up top here. We've got a speaker connected to the back of the radio, that red lead. Okay, let's bring the voltage up further. Okay, let's bring it up to 60%. Watch the voltage climb. Oh, I actually forgot to do something. You see back here on the receiver, there's this ground and mute. You have to have a jumper between those two or nothing comes out of the receiver. So this is a plug that's been prepared with that proper short. This is just a cover for it. We need to install that so we can hear something. At 60%, we're at about 145 volts. Let's keep going. Okay, that's 80%. We have to make sure we've got the volume up and the RF gain up. It looks like we're settling in. At full power, looks like we have about 241 volts available, which is not bad. This capacitor, I believe, has been changed out once because it's kind of nasty around it. It may actually come back. It seems like where there were replacements or work done on the receiver, you can tell just by the quality of the soldering. Now notice how the voltage is actually starting to go down. That means that the various tubes are, through their emission, are beginning to draw current. That's a good sign. That means that the radio is starting to come to life. Now, because the capacitor has 3 sections and there's quite a bit of resistance between them, it's a good idea just to let it sit like this probably for about 20 minutes until all the capacitors have completely formed. And then we're going to flip it over. We're going to put all of the crystals back in and see if we can hear something on this. You're not going to believe this, but about 5 minutes into that, suddenly I started hearing noise and hum coming out of the receiver. It's a good sign. I'm going to be using this generator to do the alignment on the receiver, but we're still in the bring up process. This is a test cable. It has a phono connector, RCA phono on one side, and it's got a nice BNC connector, male, on the other side. Why that cable? That's going to allow us to connect to our generator for alignment with an adapter. It's going to give us SO239, PL259, so we can hook it up to an antenna, and you could even hook it up into an N type connector if you had test equipment that was N. So that particular test cable is important. So how are you doing so far? Is this bring up a little too much for you? In the next video we get into the nitty-gritty of the alignment of the receiver. We find a few more problems, but ultimately we will succeed. This receiver, built in the early 60s, this model particularly, probably before 1965, all of these are going to need some work. Unless they've had alignment, or better than that, unless they've had some parts replaced, especially the capacitors, you can't expect any of these receivers to operate. So when you see them for sale, remember, let the buyer beware. They are going to need some work.